Fire them up. Fire them up. You kind of hear this surge of power. Yeah. All right. So, good morning, everyone. Tim Holtz here at the Ranger booth at Creativation. Got a lot of cool stuff to show you this morning. First, we're just going to talk about some of the accessories that we've added to the Distress line, and then we're going to get to the really, really good stuff. It's all good stuff, but we got to start somewhere. So, a couple of things. First off, we have some new storage bags. All the signature designers have a set of storage bags. These are sold in a 3-pack. Cool little storage envelopes that you can use for a lot of different things. I use it for grid blocks, stencils, foam stamps. It's made out of the same material as our other bags, which means you can easily wipe off your inks and things like that. It's just nice. Never have too much storage, which brings me to the Distress Crayon storage tin. Now the Distress crayons are now complete. We finished releasing the last 3 sets and Bundled Sage. Bundled Sage was the color that never made it in a set, simply because Picket Fence is really not part of the Distress palette in its terms of 60 colors, okay? Distress has 60 colors plus white and 3 metallics, but because I wanted that white crayon at the very beginning, by the time I put all my sets together, there was one left over. That was Bundled Sage, just by luck of the draw. So what's cool about that is now we have a complete palette of the crayons, and the tin is very convenient because, of course, it holds onto 36 crayons, but because there are 61 colors, it's much easier if you split your crayons up and not fill the tin completely, because it makes it much easier to work in. Now the tin also fits the storage jars. Would you mind grabbing me that tin right down there? It's pretty cool because, you know, anytime you have storage, the more modular you have, the better. Thank you. So the storage tin also fits the jars. So we have some storage jars with the brushed aluminum tops that you can put your embellishments in, glitters, embossing powders, and that will hold 12 jars, and the jars are sold in 6-packs. So again, having storage that has a couple of different functions, always really a good idea. Then we have Distress Collage Medium. This was a medium that we launched at CHA last year. A great medium because we have it in matte and crazing and vintage. But as someone that does a lot of mixed media or assemblage work, you know, when you're gluing those tiny little pieces, using your brush or the jar was really inconvenient. So we've taken that same medium. This is the matte Distress Collage Medium. It's only in matte because that's all you need when you're using it as a glue. And this is a great glue because it has a fine tip that allows me to apply this medium to any of my embellishments. Because remember, with Collage Medium, you can glue metal, glass, plastic, rubber, paper, wood, and not only does it not have any shine at all when it dries, but it actually shrinks when it dries. Which means if you glue an embellishment and you get that glue ooze out there, it's going to shrink under the embellishment, so your project is cool and secure. So those are some of the new things that we did in the world of Distress, but I don't know, the star of the show for this one is Distress Oxide. Distress Oxide is the newest ink in the Distress line, and I really love the evolution of Distress, going from our ink pads to our stains and paints and markers and glitters and powders and all that great stuff. But to have a new ink pad, something totally different, is very exciting. And what Distress Oxide really is, it is a dye pigment fusion. I say that because it has dye in it and it also has pigment in it, but what it does is it oxidizes when it gets wet. Cool thing about the case, these are kind of in a silver plastic, because I wanted it to be easily identifiable from your regular Distress pad. So these are kind of a metallic looking plastic. This is the same felt pad though. Usually when you see a pigment pad, you're expecting that squishy foam. This is not a pigment ink. It has pigment in it, but it is not a pigment ink pad, meaning it doesn't have all that glycerin, it's not squishy, it's not sticky. It's easily blendable and easily stampable because we have this great secure felt, which is cool. And I'm gonna show you some techniques. Now, understanding this whole dye pigment fusion is key, because what we have is, when you're working with just a traditional dye ink, we have that translucent factor, that factor that you really have to be careful with what's underneath it, because it's always gonna impact your color. Here with Oxide, it sits on the surface and it has some really great coloring. So whether you're working with dark colors or light colors, the difference between the translucent dye and kind of having that little bit of pigment in there, this is where the magic is about to happen. So before I start, just want to share that it works on multi-surfaces, so you can scan down there different colors of paper, so you can use it on your light cardstock, craft cardstock, black cardstock if you want. When you're stamping with it, it stamps with impeccable detail. Even those thin little lines, usually when you have a pigment ink, it gets very kind of squishy, oozes out everywhere, and regardless of the color of paper, that's really going to be the factor of the effect or color that you get with oxides. So let's take you through the stamping. If you just stamp with oxides on any colored paper, it's like stamping with a pigment ink. You're going to get that nice color that you have. It's going to dry. You can use a heat tool, but it will air dry because, again, it doesn't have the glycerin in it. But because it is an oxide, it is reactive with water. So if you spray this with water at any time, whether the ink is wet or dry, it will oxidize. And it will change the factor. It will just bring up this pigment layer that actually creates this oxidized effect. Very cool. And when we talk about oxidize, you think, oh, it's going to be a chalk ink that's going to rub off. It does not. It stays right on the surface, which is pretty neat. You can stamp on a surface, like for example, this is just stamped on a manila tag, and be happy with it. If you just missed it, that's going to give you that single oxidized layer. But as you start to wet this is where you're going to see the change, where that dye and pigment start to separate. So a couple of sprays of water, you're going to see not only your oxidized layer, but your dye is going to start to wick out. Because remember, distress is always reactive with water. And because this is a dye and pigment fusion, we've got some dye and some pigment going on. So the more water we add, the more dye is going to start seeping around our image. But our image remains our image because there's pigment. Right? Because if it was just dye and you kept spraying with water, the whole thing would just wash off your paper and you're like, okay, cool background, let's stamp something now. But here, we can actually keep our image and still get that great color factor. Now, if you like to just ink your stamp, spray your stamp with water and stamp it, we even get an oxidized watercolor. So whether you're using a stamp or even if you're using a water brush, you can watercolor with these and they will oxidize as you're watercoloring. Because once it's combined with water, that's what creates the oxidized effect. Got it? Cool. Okay, so now I'm going to show you kind of some technique with it. What's unique about this is it's a total game changer. Because we have a pigment and a dye, our ability to layer is endless. Because when we're working with dye inks and they're translucent and the base layer is affecting it, at some point you have to stop inking or you're just going to make mud. But not with oxide. Because it's got that pigment, it's going to continue to layer color on top of color. These two tags are exactly the same palette, exactly the same. This is Distress ink. This is Distress Oxide. So you can see with the inks, as we start to layer more of those blues and yellows, we get a lot of green because those are dyes, they're impacted by the others. Or on the oxide, it doesn't matter what layer, you can clearly identify where we have blue layer, where we have brown, where we have green, where we have yellow, because they will layer on top of one another. So let's put these to action. When we work with this, I'm just going to press down on my craft sheet and just place my oxides. Now we can use these through a stencil, we can use this with a blending tool, we can use this with a stamp. Anything you do with your distress inks already, you can do with oxide. So it's not like, relearning everything. If you're like, ooh, I love to blend, great, you can blend with these. Now when I work with these, I do try to keep them kind of separate on my craft sheet. I don't want to cross-contaminate much because it is a pigment. So for example, if I happen to take this color and maybe I drag it through another color, it's going to stain the ink pad, okay? Don't worry about it. Because this is a felt pad, all you have to do is wipe off the top and it's going to completely clean any oxide that's on there. So that's really good for a lot of people that like their stamp pads clean and look at them and talk to them and you're like, you're okay. Me, I'm just like, yep, you'll be good. Let's see what happens next time. Then I'm just going to go and spray this with water. Now I want to spray this with water so I can see droplets, and you can see that that color kind of illuminates on your craft sheet. That's where you know, okay, it's ready to go with the first layer. First layer meaning I can just take a piece of paper. I'm using mixed media heavy stock, but really it could be any kind of paper. It could be watercolor paper, it could be manila tag, whatever you want. I'm just going to go in and dry this. It's important when you're working with any kind of ink that if you want to blend color, that's wet on wet. If you want to layer color, that's wet on dry. Okay, that base layer has to be dry in order to layer another color. Otherwise, if I just kept moving that tag around, wet on wet would just mix everything together. So now I'm just going to start tapping into that ink that's there. We're starting to build some oxidized layers, and you can see that even though I've mixed a bunch of colors that you probably never should in the dye world, you don't want to put orange with purple with green with blue because, well, unless you like brown. I'm good with that. That's a good color combo. But a lot of people, when they're like, oh, I want all those pretty colors, and they swipe through, they're like, that's not good. Oxides allow you to do that. There are really no rules when it comes to that. So if you have mud on your craft sheet, in other words, if you have some color that you don't want, get rid of it, okay? We can always go back and apply a layer, which is what I'm going to do. I have a nice foundation of color, and you see that as it dries, it kind of has this, I don't know, dreamy, chalky kind of look, but we can still build on that. So let's go in with some more broken china and add a nice blue layer. And just for shock, let's take some pink. We're gonna do we'll do a little worn lipstick. All right, I'm gonna spray some of that, spray some of that. And now we'll go in and we're gonna add another layer. Now you can see pink on green. The fact that we can see that, that's really cool. And as it dries, we do get this very soft, oxidized pink. It's just crazy. It's like what's happening is what shouldn't happen, you know, in our ink world. And the more color you add, the more oxidation will occur. In other words, the deeper layers you have, you'll get more and more white. And I'll show you some other samples of this too. And you just keep layering. It's so cool because those are all the things that it's like, well, I shouldn't be able to do that. No, you shouldn't, but this will let you. And then I'm going to even break this up because remember, this is always going to react with water. So even though we've dried some of the layers, just like we do in distress, we can add some water and we can even lift through some of those layers to get those white effects coming through. Really cool. I know. It's like ice cream. It's cool. All those colors, yeah, because you would think, well, you can't add all those colors and just keep layering and layering. It'd be horrible. No. And besides that, it has such a soft palette. It has a soft feel. It's like feel-o-vision. Feel-o-vision.
Oh, it does. It's suede.
It's suede, exactly. And you would expect that when you touch it, that it would come off on your fingers like a chalk ink. You'd be like, oh, it doesn't. It's on there. Yeah. She's like, look, here's my finger.
Everybody, my thumb is clean.
Yeah. But as you can see, the more colors you start to build and layer, the more oxidized look you get. And even if you do a single color and you keep layering and layering, you can create kind of a rusty effect. Really cool. I'll pass these around. You guys need to really give them a feel. Like you have to feel what that surface is like. Now, when we're working with oxides, we can work with them just on their own. But let's not forget our favorite friends. We can't forget Distress ink, right? It can't be something where you're like, oh, there's a new kid in town, I'm done with my Distress inks. No way. Combine them gives you a totally different look. This is a tag where we've combined Distress ink with Distress oxide. So you can see instead of having that kind of all over dreamy look, we have a little bit more of that dye kind of popping through the background. So that's what I'm going to show you also, is that we can kind of take a little bit of both. So I'll just take a little gathered twigs there. Maybe we'll throw in, do a brighter color, maybe we'll do a little pine needles. And we'll go in with a patina on this one. And let's just share some blues in here. Take that, little faded jeans. So just so you can see on the sheet, we've got dye ink here, oxide here. Doesn't really matter how you place them on your craft sheet, but just so you can identify as we start to layer this. Now we can go in and we can combine these. And you'll notice that the colors that I've used in Distress ink are always going to peek through my oxide layer. It's always going to be there. Spray a little water. Yeah. Get that to really start moving. All right, go back into that Distress, put a little bit of oxide. It's so good. Dang, it's good. Yeah.
Even the sun.
It's, yeah. I mean, seriously, I've been demoing it, like, you just think, well, I wonder if this is going to turn out. And it's like, it's just good. You know, because that's your fear. If you've used Distress ink, you kind of think your same thing. You have these crazy color combos in your head, and you think to yourself, I wonder if this is going to turn out. But with oxide, you just can add another layer. And you surprise yourself with what you choose, you know, the colors that you decide to go with. So on this one, see how I've gone in, I kept layering blue, but that brown and that pine needles green keep shining through. That's the thing to keep in mind. If you really want a color that's going to kind of dominate your background, do that in ink and layer some other colors in oxide, because it's always going to build on top of it. And I can go in, because I know that this is my oxide area, and I can even add some brighter dots of color over the top of it. So here I've got some of that broken china that's sitting on top of that brown. And I'm just dripping water because it likes water. Or I can just mist the whole thing. Now another great thing for those that are familiar with Distress ink and use Distress a lot, Distress Microglaze. This is a sealer for Distress ink. You can put this over a stamped image, over a background, and it makes Distress ink waterproof. It also makes Distress oxide waterproof, and it doesn't change the oxide layer. So you would think, well, wait a minute, if I put that over the top, it's not going to be that kind of milky, chalky look anymore. Yes, it will. It does not impact that, because we're not dealing with the chalk ink. We're dealing with an oxide. It's crazy. It was years in the making. It really was. And so to actually finally have it, it was good because it was a lot of tests because what we wanted just didn't exist. It's not like I just want a pigment ink and I want a dye. I'm like, I want a pigment that thinks it's a dye and plays like a dye and acts like a dye. And to stamp over it, just real quick to show you, absolutely. You can stamp over this. This is stamped with archival. So you would think, wait a minute, all those layers, it's going to impact my image. It doesn't. So those are the cool things with Distress Oxide.
Do you
Pretty
recommend
awesome.
archival to stamp on it, or can you use?
You can use other inks, but I find that archival is going to be the most impactful. That's my favorite. Sure, thanks. I find that the most impactful. So you could stamp with Distress on there, but of course it's going to really conflict with your background. So I like to stamp with archival, but I mean any other waterproof or permanent ink is really going to give you the most impact when it comes to layering. But I was pretty impressed with its stampability too. I know a lot of times when you start getting too many pigment layers on a surface, it starts to affect if you're working with a translucent dye, usually when you have a pigment background, you kind of want to stamp with pigment. Not the case with this, so I found that really a great feature. I've been stamping for many years. I've just never been a fan of pigment inks because of all their pitfalls. You know, the fact that they're sticky and gooey and, you know, difficult to blend and impossible to layer. You know, one pigment just covers another pigment. So that was really the inspiration for Oxide is I want the ability to layer both and kind of infuse them, but also get like such a great look and feel that someone's gonna pick that up and be like, what is that? Is it paint? Is it ink? What is it? It's Oxide. It's great. And even something as simple as misting it with water to create something just so beautiful, pretty simple. So, any other questions?
Can you emboss with it?
You can emboss with it. You can stamp with it and emboss with it. And the big difference, remember, even with Distress ink, we can emboss, right? So if we stamp and emboss with this, we're going to have that translucent color underneath. If you stamp and emboss with Oxide, you can emboss on craft and it's going to be far more opaque, almost like opaque embossing powders. So instead of that translucent effect, you get a much more opaque effect. Because this ink it's a very wet ink. Even though it's on that felt pad,
Super juicy.
it's a very wet ink, but it has no glycerin, so it's not going to be sticky. It's just going to go right in. It's magic. It's creative wizardry. That's what that is. Yeah. It is. I love it. Any other questions? No? Well, thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your morning here for our BNP event. You bet.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to give our video a thumbs up and subscribe to Scrap Time videos on YouTube to be the first to see all our videos from Creativation.